Have you ever heard of a man who bought a forgotten cabin for only $6,000 and discovered something buried beneath its fireplace that changed an entire town? In the middle of a snowstorm, a war veteran and his loyal German shepherd stepped into a mystery no one dared to touch for years. What they found wasn't a ghost story, but a secret powerful enough to bring justice to the living and peace to the lost. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight, and do you believe every old house keeps a truth waiting to be found? Leave a comment and let's see who's brave enough to find out. The sky above Pine Hollow had the color of forged steel, a winter lid pressing down on the valley, and the snow came in thin needles that found the seams of every coat and cuff. The town itself, 3 streets crossing a state highway, a clapboard courthouse, a shuttered diner with a neon cherry pie that refused to die, was wedged between dark fir slopes and a frozen river that moved beneath its own glass. At the edge of the municipal fairgrounds, an auction bell tolled against the wind. Ethan Miles stood with his hands buried in the pockets of a thrift store peacoat, his breath making a private cloud he could step into and out of as bids were called. Ethan was 34, 5'11" when he remembered to stand straight, with a lean runner's frame that clothes never quite understood. He wore his fatigue like a second posture. There was a puckered arc of a scar high on his left temple, a memento from a teenage ski crash. It glowed paler and cold. His brown hair had the stubborn wave of someone who cut it with kitchen scissors, and there was a permanent furrow between his brows that gave his face a thinking man's gravity. He had the patient, quiet energy of a man who counted exits when he walked into a room. Not paranoia, exactly, just a reflex burned in by years of freelance field work and too many motels. He was here because he wanted stillness that wasn't a hotel night, a roof that could remember his name, and because the cabin on Lot 37 had whispered to a stubborn part of him that had never stopped loving the sound of wind and trees. At his heel sat Ranger, a sable and tan German shepherd just over 4 years old, 65 pounds of watchfulness and tendon-sprung grace. Ranger's coat was deep and glossy even in the gray light, with a black saddle and a dark, intelligent face that tilted minutely at every hinge of sound. A thin white blaze tucked in under his chin like an unbuttoned collar. He had been trained for calm more than aggression. Search cues, scent games, off-leash heel, and he carried himself like he understood that he was responsible for the emotional weather of the man beside him. He wore a plain leather collar and a scar on his right forepaw, a hairless crescent from an old snare injury that had made him wary of wire and grateful for kindness. Lot 37, the riverside parcel and associated structure, as is, where is, called the auctioneer, a barrel-throated man with a red-knit cap pulled low. The auctioneer, Tom Burchell, middle 50s, stout, with the too-wide grin of someone who has practiced it into armor, had wind-bitten cheeks and a half-moon of frost on his mustache. He liked to turn every lot into a story, and every story into a dare. He gestured with his clipboard toward a laminated photo of a dark-shouldered cabin with a stone chimney and a shallow-pitched roof bowed by snow. Now, we all know this one, Tom said, and the small knot of townspeople, boots creaking, scarves aflutter, gave the collective hum of a shared rumor. Our late friend, the Reynolds place, tax delinquent, roof straight as an arrow if you squint. We're starting at 3,000. Ethan kept his face still. The story wasn't in the brochure. He'd learned it 2 hours earlier from a gloveless man nursing coffee from a paper cup. The man, who had introduced himself simply as Cal, had the wiry build of a chainsaw veteran and colorless eyes. Cal's story arrived the way gossip always pretends to be reluctant. Reporter gone missing, he'd said. City guy, name of Sam Walker, big on crusades, came up 3 winters back to write about something that didn't want to be written about. Last seen near the river cut. Cabin shows up in the wrong conversations after that. Doors stuck. Windows sweating and cold. The kind of talk that oils superstition and rusts common sense. Ethan had nodded, asked nothing, and filed the name away like you set a pin in a map. 3,000 became 3,500. Ethan lifted his hand once, cleanly, and the crowd's attention slid over him like rain over wax. 5,000 from a man in a blaze orange jacket, the casual, speculative gesture of someone who would forget about the bid by spring. 5, 6,500, Ethan said, Or rather, he raised 2 fingers and let Tom do the saying for him. Ranger's ears twitched toward the bell as it rang for the last time. "Sold," Tom sang, and the steel sky gave up a brighter flurry as if on cue. Paperwork was done under a tent where a little propane heater made sorrowful noises and failed to compete with the draft. The county clerk, Mrs. Everly, a tall woman whose coat was the green of bottled mineral water, with a long face accustomed to neutrality, tapped forms into alignment. She had a small enamel brooch of a pine cone on her lapel and the posture of a former ballet teacher. Spine a straight opinion, hands precise. She spoke with a professionalism that survived the wind, slid Ethan a pen, verified a cashier's check, and smiled with the corners of her mouth only. When she mentioned lore, as if it were a tax category, she did it without leaning in. "Keys," she said finally, producing a brass ring with an old skeleton key and a newer, duller padlock twin. "Drive down the half-plowed track until the river fence. Come back to town if you find anything unfortunate. Snow's set to lift this afternoon." Ethan thanked her, tucked the keys deep, and whistled Ranger close. They walked to the truck, an aging gray Tacoma with a cracked dashboard and a windshield nicked by a traveling life. Ranger hopping to the back seat as if the cold were an insult to be ignored. The road east out of town narrowed to 2 ruts divided by a ridge of snow. A line of cottonwoods scribbled the riverbank, their branches laced with hoar frost like spun sugar on a wire skeleton. The suppression of sound you get in deep cold created its own privacy. Even the engine seemed to muffle itself. Pine Hollow receded in the rear view into a cluster of rooflines indistinguishable from the drifts. They reached the turnoff marked by a leaning mailbox with numbers flaked into illegibility. The cabin revealed itself in stages as they crept the last 100 yards. First the pitch of the roof nosing out from the firs, then the broad face of a stone chimney patched with lighter rectangles of mortar, and finally the front porch, a shallow stoop with a rail that slumped like a tired shoulder. Close up, the place looked less haunted than exhausted. The logs had silvered to a driftwood tone, and the windows were squinted shut against the weather, panes filmed with a dull opal bloom from months of condensation. Ethan killed the engine, and the silence fell hard. He stood with the keys in his palm and looked without romanticizing. He noted a narrow side window set off center on the north wall, and the wedge of a plank braced against it from outside, a makeshift jam that suggested either repair or refusal. He let his gaze slide back to the chimney. The stones were locally gathered, river smooth and heavy, but the mortar down low, near the firebox, bore streaks a shade younger, thin vertical tears like someone had iced a cake with haste and cold hands. Ranger sniffed the air, then lowered his nose to the snow at the base of the porch steps, drawing an invisible perimeter with methodical sweeps. His tail carried a slow half-mast wag, the working tail of a dog reading the morning. Inside, the lock turned with the kind of reluctant click that remembers every hand before yours. The air, when Ethan opened the door, had that shut-up smell. Dust, old paper, the metallic shy of cold cast iron. The single room made no apology for its simplicity. Wide plank floor, a table with a missing corner, 2 chairs that did not agree with each other, and along the back wall a sink with a hand pump. The fireplace dominated the east wall, the keystone an oblong piece of granite darker than its neighbors, the hearth a black mouth lined with soot like a smoker's teeth. There were the gestures of a life paused, a mug turned upside down to keep out mice, a pair of boots like bookends by the door, a wool blanket folded on a trunk. Ethan moved through the space with a scan drawn from too many rentals and safe houses, windows first. See how they sit in their frames, note the lines of paint and where the glass had been replaced. Then door trim, then flooring for telltale seams. He pressed his fingertips to the pane of the narrow side window, north, the one with the external brace, and the glass was stubborn and cold. He shoulder-tested the sash. It rose an inch, then stuck hard, the frame chewing at it. He let it settle back, left it be. At the fireplace, he crouched and let his gloved fingers trace a dribble of mortar that had caught on the edge of a stone and hardened there like a run of candle wax. "We'll get heat first," he told Ranger, who had finished his survey and now looked at him with the mild expectation of a partner awaiting instructions. Ethan gathered split logs from the wood box, dry enough, resinous, and built a fire with the quiet competence of someone who had learned the sequence once and kept practicing it all his life. Tinder belly, kindling tent, log crib. The match flared, the kindling took, a sound like someone shallow breathing. He set a pot with a few inches of water near the edge of the grate to temper the air and cracked the door for a draft. Ranger lay down on the braided oval rug before the hearth, front paws crossed, ears working like small satellite dishes. Snow hissed faintly against the window, the storm reasserting itself in 1,000 soft collisions. As the flames strengthened and the first sweet scorch of pitch filled the room, Ranger's head lifted and tilted with quick bird-like precision. It was not a lazy curiosity. It was as if a letter had arrived in a language only he could read. He stood, not fully, just enough to turn his chest toward the hearth, and he breathed in, 2 short draws, 1 long, before his body made a decision separate from Ethan's. The shepherd stepped closer to the fire, with what looked to the uninitiated like boldness, and to Ethan like concern. He lowered his head until his nose was level with the plane of heat, blinked against it, and then he did something he had done twice before in their years together, and only in the presence of certain scents. He pawed the floor in a short, abraded scrape that made a sandpaper sound against the old boards, and a low sound came out of him. Not a growl exactly, but a warning vowel that lives in the throat of a dog when something is wrong at the level of elements. Ethan's spine registered it before his mind did. He looked at the fire, and then at the back of the fire, at the throat of the chimney. He inhaled. Wood smoke carried its own catalog, maple sweet, alder thin, pine too hungry for its own good. But this note huddled under the smoke like a stowaway, a dark terry scent with a plastic sheen, the chemical ghost of something petroleum-born, the smell of black resin, the kind mechanics complain about, the way cable jackets smell when a transformer blows. "Easy," Ethan said, the word a reflex to soothe the dog, yet his eyes had sharpened. He reached for the poker, stirred the logs, watching for any sign of treated wood, old creosote, something that would explain the wrongness. Ranger took a half step backward and then forward again, the pendulum of a decision finishing its swing toward action. The dog's hackles rose in a ridge as fine as breath, not full rage, only an alert flare along the shoulder. Snow popped off the burning bark in tiny starbursts. The stink didn't dissipate, it gathered. Ethan stood, feeling the old scar on his temple wake, as it did in cold and trouble. He looked at the keystone, the darker slab with the slightly different grain, and at the pale tiers of mortar below it that seemed newer in the fire's pulse. Somewhere outside, the wind found the eaves and made a thin flute of them. Ranger moved closer to the stones and put his nose to the seam where the hearth met the floorboard lip. He inhaled once, grimaced in a very dog way, lip lifting, a wrinkle carving between his eyes, and then he fixed Ethan with a look that contained, with almost human economy, both question and insistence. Ethan's mouth went dry. He imagined wires where there should be nothing, pits where there should be mortar, or the careless remains of somebody else's solution to a problem that should not be solved with accelerant. He pictured the laminated photo from the auction, where the chimney seemed only chimney, the way paper is never the same as thing. He reached past Ranger to ease the kettle farther from the fire, and felt heat nip the back of his hand. The sour chemical undertone pulsed again. Ranger gave a short, violent sneeze, shook his head once, and then leaned his shoulder into Ethan's thigh. A herd dog's push. Move, now, here, away. They had been in the cabin less than an hour, and already the room had moved from promise to question. Ethan slid the poker back into its stand, crossed to the door, and opened it wide to pull a draft straight through the room, his breath gusting a white frontier across the threshold. Cold air rolled in with the authority of a tide. The fire's flame recoiled, then steadied. The stubborn streak in him, old and bone deep, wanted to stare the scent down into reason. But Ranger's insistence outvoted pride. "Outside," Ethan said softly, and Ranger was already pivoting, already reading the arc of the command from the lean of Ethan's shoulders. The shepherd crossed the rug and was through the doorway in a single fluid line, paws ticking down the porch boards. Ethan followed, key turning in muscle memory to keep the latch from slapping in the wind. On the threshold, he paused, looked back once at the hearth and the darker stone with its new-looking seams, and he let the question harden into a fact. There was something in that chimney beyond smoke and heat, something that did not belong. He pulled the door shut, Snow braided the air into slanted cords. Ranger lifted his muzzle to the wind, and Ethan pressed his palm to the cold cabin wall as if to learn it by touch. He told himself he owned this now, and sometimes ownership meant listening to the thing you'd bought when it tried to talk to you. Ranger looked up, and he looked down and then back at the door, and for the first time since the bell had rung and the property had become theirs, Ethan felt the strange, familiar edge of a story find him. He did not yet know the name of the missing reporter would join it, or how the town's winter would carry more than weather. He only knew that the fire had breathed out a secret, and his dog had heard it first. He put 2 fingers to his lips and whistled Ranger. To heal. "We'll start again," he said to the snow, as if it were a person, and then he let the wind push the rest of the thought out of his mouth, unspoken, into the white. The storm thinned overnight, leaving the world rinsed and hollow. Morning sunlight slanted through gray cloud bands, bright enough to sting the eyes but too weak to warm. Pine Hollow woke beneath a quilt of frost, the kind that stiffened telephone wires into silver vines and froze the breath of early risers midair. Ethan brushed snow off the Tacoma's hood, the sound crisp in the stillness, while Ranger trotted in slow circles around the truck, tail sweeping paths into the powder. They drove back into town for supplies. The tires hissed over packed snow, the radio murmuring a local weather station that sounded half asleep. Pine Hollow in daylight looked friendlier, but not less strange, a cluster of painted facades that pretended the 20th century hadn't ended. The Jenkins General Store sat on the corner across from the post office, its signboard creaking faintly with each gust. Inside, the air was thick with warmth and the tang of oiled wood. Shelves were stocked with a little of everything: canned peaches, hunting knives, enamel mugs, wool gloves, and behind the counter, jars of penny candy that had probably seen 2 generations of children. The storekeeper, Martha Jenkins, looked up as the bell chimed. Martha was in her early 60s, round-shouldered but bright-eyed, with gray hair twisted into a bun that refused to stay neat. Her hands bore the soft polish of years, counting change and sorting mail. She smiled with half her mouth, the other half cautious, like someone who wanted to be kind but had seen too many people leave before spring. "Well now, you must be the fella bought the Reynolds place," she said, squinting over her glasses. "Town's been buzzing." Ethan returned the smile with professional restraint. "I guess I'm the buzz then. Need kerosene, canned goods, and coffee. Oh, and any map that covers the river stretch east of here." Martha disappeared into a back cabinet and returned with an old topographic map, edges soft and tea-stained. "That's the one Sam Walker used to mark up," she said, voice lowering without meaning to. "The reporter. You've heard about him?" "Just a little." Ethan unfolded the map on the counter. "Walker was a curious sort," Martha continued, leaning in. "Came nosing around 3 winters ago. Said he was doing a piece on water rights, or pollution, depending who you ask. He stayed out by the old cabin a while. Then, one night, storm came through, just like last night. Next morning, his rental car was still there. But he wasn't. Sheriff's men searched the riverbank for weeks. Never found so much as a bootlace." Her eyes drifted toward Ranger, who sat obediently by Ethan's feet, gaze steady, ears rotating slightly to follow the rhythm of her speech. "Fine animal," she said. "They say dogs know things before people do. You keep him close." Ethan folded the map carefully, slid it into his jacket. "That's the plan." When he left, Martha stood at the window and watched him cross the street, her reflection trapped against the glass like an older version of the town itself, something watching time move on without permission. At the courthouse, Ethan found a display case of local history photographs near the clerk's office. Among faded images of logging crews and school picnics hung a newer picture. A smiling group labeled Blackwell Industries, Water Reclamation Initiative. A ribbon cutting, maybe 2 years old. In the center stood a man in a dark overcoat, tall and sharp-featured, grin wide but eyes unreadable. The brass plaque beneath the photo had been polished recently. "Big benefactor," said a voice behind him. Ethan turned. The man in uniform was Deputy Roy Markson, mid-30s, fit in the way that came from habit more than vanity. Hair cropped short, smile professional, but too quick to appear. His badge gleamed like it had just been buffed, and his gloves were tucked neatly into his belt. "Welcome to Pine Hollow," Markson said, offering a handshake that was firm without challenge. Word travels fast in a small town. You picked quite the spot. I like quiet, Ethan said. Quiet's rare out that way. You're off County Road 11, right? Past the split near the river fence. Ethan nodded, wondering how the man already knew. That's the one. Markson tilted his head, studying him. Funny thing, those boundaries up there get messy after the floods. County lines, property rights, runoff from the reclamation site. Best keep a map handy. Wouldn't want to wander onto someone's land by accident. I'll remember that. The deputy's smile lingered a beat too long. You do that, and if you need anything, well, my radio's always on. Ethan left the courthouse with a polite nod, but his pulse had tightened. People who offered help too quickly often had plans for repayment. That evening, the town's lights dimmed early under a thick sky. Snow began again, soft and soundless, turning the streets into corridors of light and shadow. Ethan parked by the cabin just before dark. The world was still, except for the faint groan of settling ice. Ranger leaped from the truck, nose to the wind, tail stiff. Inside, Ethan stacked the new supplies near the wall and hung his coat by the door. The cabin had warmed slightly from the earlier fire, but the air still carried that chemical whisper he couldn't forget. He unpacked the map and spread it on the table, tracing the penciled lines that marked the river bends. Someone, likely Sam Walker, had circled 3 points near the stream labeled Sample A, Sample B, and Drainage. Ranger sat beside him, eyes amber in the lamplight. Yeah, Ethan murmured. We'll check those once the weather breaks. A sudden noise outside made Ranger's head snap toward the window. Something small but deliberate, like metal brushing metal. Ethan extinguished. The lamp moved quietly to the window. Through the curtain gap, he saw only falling snow and the dim glow of the truck's taillights reflected in ice. Then, faint and fleeting, a glint like sunlight off glass, somewhere beyond the tree line. He watched for a full minute. The light vanished. Silence reclaimed the woods. Ethan relit the lamp, forcing himself to exhale. Maybe just hunters, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Ranger remained at the window, motionless, pupils wide. Later, as Ethan lay on the cot, the wind pressed snow against the cabin in soft, shifting sighs. He could almost imagine the forest breathing. Ranger slept near the door, but woke once, ears flicking toward a distant sound, a low drone, mechanical, fading quickly over the ridge. A drone, maybe, a motor too small for snowmobiles, too steady for wind. Ethan listened, waiting. Nothing followed, only the creak of branches settling under ice. When dawn finally came, the storm had sealed every track. The world outside was smooth, untouched, but somewhere in the whiteness, near the edge of the trees, something metallic glimmered faintly beneath a skin of frost, as if watching had become part of the landscape itself. The storm arrived like a moving wall of white, swallowing the valley one ridge at a time. The radio had warned of 70-mile gusts and road closures before noon, but by the time Ethan realized how fast it was closing in, the world outside had already dissolved. Wind clawed at the cabin with icy hands, and every board answered with its own groan. He checked the generator. Dead. Snowflakes slanted through the cracks in the doorframe, melting into small silver tears on the wood. Ranger paced near the hearth, his claws clicking, tail stiff. He hated confinement. His whole body was a compass needle searching for direction. Ethan layered another blanket over the window brace and fed the fire. The flames fluttered, uneasy, throwing a restless orange over the walls. The strange chemical undertone had returned, faint but unmistakable. Ethan crouched before the fireplace, examining the darker keystone again. The mortar seams still looked too fresh, too clean compared to the older, smoke-stained stones. The wind outside howled, carrying a tone that made the chimney hum faintly like a hollow pipe organ. "Something's behind you," Ethan muttered under his breath. He didn't believe in haunted houses. He believed in things left behind by careless people. The smell had a man-made certainty to it. Ranger pressed his nose against the edge of the hearth, sneezed once, then pawed at the lowest seam again. Ethan fetched his multi-tool and a small pry bar from his pack. He hesitated a moment, then whispered, "All right, partner. Let's see what they built into you." The keystone was larger than it looked, solid granite fitted like a puzzle piece. He chipped away the softest line of mortar, feeling it crumble under pressure. When the stone loosened, it gave a sigh like something relieved to be unburdened. He caught its weight before it fell, setting it aside carefully. Behind it, the cavity yawned dark. A faint smell of metal and mildew slipped out. Inside, wedged between two smaller stones, lay a rectangular tin box stamped with military markings. He eased it free and brushed off soot. U.S. Army Surplus, Field Container, 1952. The latch resisted, then snapped open with a dry pop. Inside were items wrapped in waxed cloth, a small leather-bound notebook, a plastic sample vial clouded with white residue, and several folded papers sealed inside a transparent bag. The notebook's cover was cracked but intact. Ethan sat at the table and opened it. The first page bore neat, angular handwriting. S. Walker, Pine Hollow, Field Notes. His heart tightened. The missing journalist. Ethan flipped through the pages. Some were smudged, watermarked by damp, but he could still make out fragments. Blackwell test site. Contamination exceeds legal limits. Another page. Water sample near cabin. Contains traces of arsenic and lead. Not natural seepage. Deliberate runoff. Evidence buried in drainage pipes along northern bank. The last entry was a single line, scribbled fast and heavy. If they find this, I was right. Ethan exhaled through his teeth. So, that's what you were chasing, Sam. He turned to the documents, lab reports stamped with state insignias, all showing elevated toxin levels. Attached to one was a photocopy of an official citation against Blackwell Industries for waste disposal violations, dated 2 years ago, signed, then marked, withdrawn pending review. A note scrawled across it read, "They paid someone off." He closed the notebook and looked toward the window, where snow raced horizontally like a white curtain, pulled by invisible hands. His mind ticked through possibilities, what leverage these papers might have, and how long they'd stayed hidden. A faint crackle from the shortwave radio broke the silence. He crossed the room and turned the dial. Static filled the air like falling gravel. The emergency channel flickered in and out. He caught pieces of a weather update, then, unexpectedly, a male voice clear as glass. "Cabin 37. You copy?" Ethan froze. No one should have been broadcasting directly. "This is private property," he said, pressing the transmit key. The reply came quick, too casual. "Just checking on you. Roads are closed. Deputy Markson here. Thought I'd swing by later, bring a radio for backup in case power cuts out." Ethan hesitated. "Appreciate it, Deputy. Roads are already gone under snow. Better stay safe where you are." "Already en route," Markson's voice replied. Then static swallowed the rest. Ethan frowned, unease crawling through his ribs. He hadn't given his call sign or location. How did Markson know the frequency? Ranger barked once, sharp, alert. Head toward the window. Headlights flickered briefly through the snow, then disappeared. Minutes later, a knock rattled the door. Ethan opened it to find Markson on the porch, snow clinging to his parka and the brim of his hat. His smile looked rehearsed. "Hell of a storm," the deputy said. "Figured you could use company." He carried a portable radio case slung over one shoulder. "Appreciate it," Ethan said carefully, stepping aside. Markson stamped his boots clean and glanced around the cabin. "Cozy setup. Fire holding strong?" "Mostly," Ethan said. "Smells a little off." "Old creosote," Markson replied too quickly. "Those chimneys'll do that. Should get it cleaned come spring." He set the radio on the table and tested the signal. "There. You'll have county frequency access if you need help. I'll check in later." He lingered by the hearth, eyes flicking once toward the open notebook before turning back. "Nice find," he said mildly. Ethan's pulse spiked. He hadn't mentioned the notebook. Markson smiled again. "See you soon, Mr. Miles. Stay warm." When he left, tire tracks cut through the snow like two dark veins. And then, halfway down the road, they veered sharply, into the ditch before correcting. Ethan waited until the lights vanished before moving. He stepped outside to check the tracks. Fresh gouges along the edge of his own truck's tires glimmered, clean knife slashes through rubber. All four. The snow thickened, swallowing sound. Ranger growled low, the kind of sound that vibrated through the soles of Ethan's boots. "Inside," Ethan murmured. He bolted the door, pulled the shades, and stared at the papers spread on the table. A cold realization settled. Someone had known those documents were here all along. He gathered everything into a sealed plastic pouch, wrapped it tight, and slipped it under a loose floorboard near the bed. Then he sat by the dying fire, the room dimming as the storm howled outside. The air smelled of soot, fear, and decision. Ranger lay down beside him, head on paws, eyes never leaving the door. The flames guttered. Somewhere beneath the wind's roar, Ethan could almost hear the whisper of pages turning themselves, as if the cabin wanted the truth read aloud. He whispered to the empty air, "It's not just a ghost story, Sam. It's a cover-up." The fire answered with a pop, a single spark climbing the chimney like a signal flare to no one, or to everyone. Morning crept in like a rumor. The storm had slowed but hadn't stopped, and the light that seeped through the cabin windows was the kind that didn't belong to any hour, a dull, pewter glow, neither dawn nor day. Ethan sat at the table, every surface around him marked by restless thought. Notebook open, maps spread, coffee cooling untouched. Ranger slept near the door, paws twitching, as if even his dreams were tracking something. Ethan's shoulder ached from where he'd slammed into the doorframe the night before, an old joint injury flaring again. He rotated it slowly, grimacing, then focused back on the task. The air still smelled faintly of smoke and cold iron. He scanned the field notes again. Every word of Sam Walker's journal now burned into his head. If the lab results were right, Blackwell Industries had been dumping arsenic and lead-tainted waste into the valley's water supply for years. The cabin's location, on a bend near the drainage basin, made it the perfect hiding spot for anyone wanting to take samples or stash evidence. That meant Walker hadn't chosen it by accident, and neither had whoever tried to erase his work. Ethan turned the last page. At the bottom, scrawled in different ink, was a single phrase he hadn't noticed before. "Claire has the backup." He stared at it, mind clicking. Claire. Claire Donovan, an environmental scientist he'd met once during a joint investigation years ago in Oregon. She'd worked with freelance journalists, including Sam Walker. If Walker trusted her, she might still have what he'd sent before he vanished. Ethan powered up his laptop, praying the satellite link would hold long enough. The generator sputtered once before stabilizing. He composed a short encrypted message. Subject: Pine Hollow files found Walker's originals. Possible contamination evidence. Coordinates attached. Need verification and secure storage. EM. He sent it to Claire's last known address, watching the progress bar inch forward. When the message confirmed delivery, he exhaled and closed the lid. Outside, the snow had softened into a steady drift. The silence was too neat, like a soundstage between takes. Ranger lifted his head, ears swiveling. Ethan followed the dog's gaze to the window. Pinned against the frost glass was a small folded paper, wedged under the outer latch. He opened the door cautiously. The wind hissed through the frame. No footprints, no tracks. Just the note fluttering like something ashamed of itself. He peeled it free. 3 words, block letters printed by hand. Return what's ours. And below it, smaller. Or next time, it burns. Ranger gave a low growl that rolled out of his chest like distant thunder. Ethan folded the note, pocketed it, and whispered, "We don't scare easy." But his pulse disagreed. He scanned the horizon, only the skeletal line of trees. The world flattened into white and gray. Yet every sense told him they weren't alone. By afternoon, the temperature dropped again. Ethan drove into town, the Tacoma hobbling on patched tires. He stopped by the library, a squat brick building, where the fluorescent lights hummed louder than conversation. The librarian, Claire, not his Claire, but Claire Jensen, the town's archivist, was a small, brisk woman in her 40s with sharp glasses and the precise energy of someone who alphabetized her spices. She looked up as he entered, instantly recognizing the outsider. "You're the man in the Reynolds cabin," she said. "What brings you here? Internet's been spotty." "Just need to scan some documents for record keeping," Ethan said. She nodded toward a back room. "Scanner's ancient, but it works. Be quick. Storm knocked half our lines last night." Ethan fed each page of Walker's notes through the machine, digitizing as much as he could. He copied everything onto a small encrypted USB drive and slipped it into his pocket. Ranger waited patiently near the door, eyes tracking every flicker of movement. Halfway through the task, a flicker caught in the reflection of the window. An SUV idling across the street, black, unmarked, engine running. A man in a winter coat sat inside, staring straight ahead. Ethan finished quickly, thanked the librarian, and left. As he crossed the street, the SUV pulled away. By evening, the snow thickened again. Back at the cabin, the generator groaned against the cold. Ethan barely had time to take off his gloves when the radio on the table crackled alive. "Evening, Mr. Miles," came a familiar voice. Markson, smooth, almost friendly. "Everything holding up out there?" "Fine," Ethan said. "That's good. Folks in town worry about newcomers. Place can be unforgiving. You find anything interesting yet?" Ethan hesitated. "Just dust and drafts." Markson chuckled, a dry sound like boots grinding on gravel. "Good. Keep it that way." Then the line went dead. A chill ran down Ethan's back that had nothing to do with the weather. He unplugged the radio and tossed a blanket over it. Ranger lifted his head again, hackles rising. It was nearly midnight when the noise came, the soft, deliberate scrape of metal on wood. Someone was picking the lock. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He motioned to Ranger, who rose soundlessly, muscles taut. The latch clicked. The door creaked open half an inch. Ranger lunged, snarling, teeth bared but controlled. A shout followed, muffled by the wind. Ethan moved fast, grabbing the fire poker from beside the hearth. The intruder stumbled backward, gun flashing in his hand. The shepherd struck first, clamping down on the man's forearm, twisting him sideways. The pistol clattered to the floor. Ethan swung the poker once, catching the man's wrist hard enough to drop him. Pain flared through Ethan's bad shoulder, but he didn't stop. He pinned the intruder's arm, kicked the gun away, and yanked a length of paracord from the table to bind his wrists. The man gasped, snow crusting his hairline. Early 40s, with the soft uniform of a construction foreman. Denim jacket, insulated vest. A patch on his sleeve read, "Blackwell Contracting." "Who sent you?" Ethan demanded. The man coughed, smirking through blood on his lip. "Just waiting for the call. Then we light it up." "Light what?" "The place. Orders are orders." His grin faltered as Ranger growled again, teeth inches from his throat. Ethan tightened the cord. "You tell your boss this house isn't theirs anymore." The man's eyes flicked toward the fireplace, the very spot where the hidden evidence had been. "You don't know what you're sitting on," he hissed. "You should have burned it when you had the chance." Ethan gagged him with a strip of cloth and shoved him against the wall. He took the gun, unloaded it, then stepped back, chest heaving. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters like bones. Ranger stood guard, unblinking. Ethan knew this was just the first move. Whoever wanted Walker's work gone wouldn't stop with intimidation. They'd escalate. He looked at the fire, the same one Ranger had growled at the first night. "They've already tried once," he whispered. "Next time, they won't miss." He shut off the lights and stared into the storm-smeared dark beyond the window. Somewhere in the distance, headlights glimmered for a moment, then vanished, like an eye blinking closed. Tomorrow, he'd decide whether to run or fight. But for now, as snow blanketed the cabin again, he tightened his grip on the truth Sam Walker had died for. The night held its breath. The storm returned with vengeance, a white leviathan swallowing the valley whole. Wind screamed through the trees and punched the cabin walls in rhythmic fury. Ethan checked his watch. Past midnight. The man he had tied to the wall, one of Blackwell's hired hands, sat slumped, bound and gagged, eyes closed in uneasy surrender. Ethan had questioned him until words turned into threats, but the only phrase the man repeated before falling silent was, "Orders are orders. Burn it clean." Now the cabin creaked like a ship at sea. Every hinge trembled. Ranger paced the floor, tail stiff as wire, ears swiveling with surgical precision. Outside, the generator coughed once, then died completely, plunging everything into darkness. Ethan clicked on his flashlight, a weak cone of yellow trembling over the table. He had already sealed the key evidence in watertight bags. Walker's notes, the lab reports, his own scans, and hidden them in the hollow beneath the bed frame. He kept only a small folder with coordinates and a burner USB drive to hand off if he didn't make it out. Snow battered the windows like thrown gravel. The fire had dimmed to coals. Ethan crouched beside Ranger and whispered, Stay sharp, buddy. This is the part they test for. A sound broke the monotony, a low, steady hum that didn't belong to wind or storm. Ranger's head lifted instantly. He growled, a deep, measured sound that seemed to come from the floorboards. Then came another noise, metal scraping against metal, rhythmic, deliberate. Ethan realized with a cold jolt what it was, someone cutting the power line that fed through the trees. He killed his flashlight. The world shrank to sound, the hiss of snow, the faint whine of engines idling beyond the ridge. Then, a sharp pop. A bullet punched through the top of the window frame, splintering wood. Ranger barked once, loud and sharp. Ethan crawled to the window, peering through a gap in the curtain. Flashes lit the storm, muzzle fire, distant, methodical. The attackers weren't charging. They were probing, mapping his defenses. He whispered to himself, 3, maybe 4 of them. He counted the intervals, the direction of shots. Not random, professional. He ducked behind the stone hearth, checked the pistol he'd taken from the intruder. 1 magazine, half full. His rifle was still in the truck, useless now, buried under snow. Another burst of light erupted outside. Something shattered near the porch, glass, or maybe the lantern he'd hung earlier. Then came the unmistakable whoosh of accelerant igniting. Fire flared along the woodpile stacked against the cabin wall. Damn it! Ethan grabbed the kettle from the hearth, sloshed what little water remained onto the burning edge of the floor, but it hissed uselessly. The heat climbed fast, greedy, crawling up the wallboards. He ripped his coat off the hook, dunked it in the snow that seeped through the cracked window, then threw it over the flames. The fire choked, faltered, but more flickers glowed outside. They were trying to smoke him out. Ranger stood rigid, nostrils flaring, his gaze fixed toward the back of the cabin. Ethan followed it and caught the faint creak of boards. A second approach. He crouched low, pistol raised. The back door trembled once, then twice. A shadow passed across the gap beneath it. When the third knock came, it wasn't hesitant. It was a boot. The lock splintered. Ethan fired once. The bullet ricocheted off the doorframe with a shriek of metal. The intruder fell back, cursing. Come on, Ethan whispered to himself. Think. He glanced toward the small side window, the one braced with wood since the first night. It was narrow, half frozen shut, but maybe enough. He yanked the brace loose, muscles burning, then pushed until the pane cracked free. Ranger, he called. The shepherd was already there, sensing the plan before words formed. Ethan slung his backpack over one shoulder, grabbed the folder of coordinates, and jammed it inside. He reached under the bed, retrieved the waterproof pouch of evidence, and tied it tight to the pack frame. Outside, flames climbed the cabin's left wall, painting the snow orange. The heat pressed through the log seams like breath. Smoke thickened fast, rolling across the ceiling. Ethan dropped to his knees, coughing, dragging the unconscious intruder toward the door. The man groaned once, half aware, before Ethan pushed him flat near the threshold. He wouldn't leave anyone to burn, not even this one. He threw the back door open just enough to shove the man into the snowdrift, then shut it again. The fire was spreading faster now, licking the curtains. He could hear voices outside, faint over the wind. He's inside! Push it! He'd have to move. Ethan soaked a wool blanket in melted snow and wrapped it around himself, the cold biting through layers of adrenaline. Then he crouched by the side window. Go, boy, he said. Ranger sprang through first, disappearing into the blizzard. Ethan followed, shoving his pack ahead, glass biting into his palms. The cold air hit him like a slap, but it tasted like life. He dropped into the snow beside the stacked woodpile, already burning at its far end, and rolled toward the dark trench where the fire hadn't reached. He heard another gunshot, closer this time. Snow spat up inches from his boots. Ranger barked, circling ahead, guiding him toward the tree line. Ethan ran crouched low, his every breath a knife in his lungs. Behind them, the cabin's roof groaned, then collapsed inward with a dull, final thud. Sparks leapt into the storm, scattering like fireflies. They reached the edge of the trees and ducked behind a fallen pine. Ethan dared to look back. The fire's glow pulsed through the snowstorm, distorted, almost beautiful in its destruction. Ranger pressed against him, panting, muzzle frosted with snow. His ears flicked left, then right. Another sound emerged from the chaos, the deep rev of an engine. A truck somewhere down the access road. Then headlights swept briefly across the burning ruins before cutting off. Ethan watched figures move near the fire, dark silhouettes in heavy coats. One held a radio to his mouth, gesturing toward the blaze. "Too clean," Ethan murmured. "They wanted it to look like an accident." He checked his pack, USB drive, evidence pouch, both intact. Relief flickered, but didn't last. The fire would destroy the rest, and without the digital files Claire now held, the truth might vanish with it. They waited, crouched in the snow, until the figures climbed into the truck and disappeared into the white curtain. Only then did Ethan let out the breath he'd been holding. "Come on, boy," he whispered. "We're not done yet." Ranger wagged his tail once, a tired acknowledgement. Together, they followed the shadow of the riverbank, disappearing into the storm's throat as behind them, the only proof of Ethan's presence, the cabin, the hearth, and its secrets, collapsed into glowing ash. By dawn, the world was a silent field of white. The air smelled of smoke and victory without triumph. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, his silhouette a thin defiance against the wind. Somewhere beneath the snow, his evidence survived. That had to be enough. For now. The first hint of dawn came like a confession. Pale light bleeding through the smoke still hanging above the pines. The storm had finally broken, leaving the valley silent and brittle. Snow lay in soft dunes across the clearing where the cabin had stood, the ash already frozen into gray crust. Ethan's breath came out ragged in the cold. His coat was torn, face streaked with soot, but he was alive. Ranger stood beside him, tail low but steady, muzzle frosted, eyes bright. He had lost his muzzle bandage in the escape. A shallow cut on his ear oozed faintly, but he didn't seem to notice. Ethan knelt, one hand buried in the shepherd's fur. "We did it, boy," he whispered, though he didn't believe it yet. The horizon burned faintly gold behind the mountain rim, casting thin light across the snowfield where the wreck of his life smoldered. He scanned the road. 2 sets of tire tracks led out. One from the truck that had torched the place, another heavier, likely county grade. He followed them uphill until he heard it, the low hum of an engine idling somewhere beyond the trees. Then came voices. He motioned Ranger down and crouched behind a fallen log. Beyond the rise, a black pickup idled, steam coiling from its exhaust. 3 men stood near it, Markson, the contractor he'd interrogated, and a 4th man wearing a tailored winter coat far too expensive for this landscape. Even at a distance, Ethan recognized the face from the courthouse photograph. Elias Blackwell. The businessman's features were sharp enough to cut frost. Silver hair combed neatly back, eyes hidden behind tinted glasses. His tone was calm, commanding. "Get the ashes cleared," Blackwell said. "No trace, no paperwork, nothing left for the feds to sniff at." Markson nodded. "Already handled. Looks like a chimney fire. Clean burn. Miles and the dog probably cooked inside. You'll have your closure." Blackwell's mouth curved in something almost like a smile. "Good. I have a meeting in Seattle by noon. Make sure the local report matches our narrative. If anyone asks, the property was still under forfeiture." Ethan felt his hands curl into fists. Ranger's low growl rumbled against his leg, barely restrained. Then, a new sound cut through the morning, the distant thump of rotors. Blackwell's head snapped upward. "What the hell?" The drone grew into a roar. A helicopter appeared above the ridge, painted white with dark lettering along the side. As it tilted, sunlight flashed across its insignia, FBI. Markson shouted, "Get down!" But it was too late. Another chopper rose from behind the river bend, then a third. Snow whipped off the treetops as floodlights flared across the clearing. A loudspeaker boomed, "Federal agents, drop your weapons and stay where you are." Chaos broke loose. The contractor dove for the truck. Markson yanked his pistol, but the sudden concussive pop of warning shots sent him sprawling into the snow. Ethan emerged from cover, pistol raised, not to fire, but to make sure they saw him. He shouted over the rotor wash, "Deputy Markson, you're done. Evidence is already out." For a heartbeat, their eyes locked. Markson's full of disbelief, then fury. He swung his weapon, but Ranger lunged, intercepting his movement. The pistol skittered away, vanishing under the snow. Agents flooded in from both flanks, tactical gear gleaming, rifles drawn. Within seconds, Markson was pinned face down, shouting curses swallowed by the wind. The contractor dropped to his knees, hands up. Blackwell stood still, his polished composure cracking for the first time. "Mr. Blackwell," a female voice called from the lead helicopter's speaker. "This site is under federal investigation. Step away from the vehicle." Blackwell turned slowly, raising his hands, lips tightening. "You think you've won?" he said quietly, voice barely audible over the blades. "You don't even know what you're fighting." Ethan approached, snow crunching under his boots. "No," he said, "but I know what you poisoned." Blackwell looked at him, studied him, really, and smiled, a tired, almost pitying expression. "Idealists never change. You'll find another crusade and die for it, too." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but not today." A pair of agents seized Blackwell's arms, reading him his rights as they led him toward the waiting vehicle. The scene unfolded in blinding order. Photographers, hazmat teams, local officers rushing to cordon off the area. Ethan stood apart, watching it all with detached relief. He felt hollow, but the kind of hollow that made space for light. Then he heard her voice. "Ethan!" He turned. Claire Donovan, bundled in a federal parka, jogged toward him, her breath clouding. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes alive with triumph. She pulled off a glove and grabbed his arm. "I got your message," she said between breaths. "I sent everything to the Bureau last night. Your scans, the coordinates, even Walker's last message. They mobilized overnight. You saved the case." Ethan let out a shaky laugh. "Guess I owe my internet provider." She smiled faintly. "And your dog. The Bureau tracked your GPS tag through his service collar. You two just became their favorite headline." Ranger barked once, tail wagging for the first time in days. Claire crouched to stroke his fur, voice softening. "You're a hero, Ranger." Ethan looked past them toward the rising sun. Smoke curled lazily upward, dissolving into pink light. "Sam Walker didn't die for nothing," he said quietly. "He left a trail someone could follow." Claire's expression turned solemn. "We'll clear the valley, Ethan. The contamination reports match your evidence. They'll shut every pipe and pump Blackwell's company ever laid here." He nodded. The words felt too large to fit in the silence that followed. Hours later, when the site had been secured and the last of the officials gone, Ethan and Ranger remained. The agents had offered him a ride to town, but he refused. He needed one last look. They stood before the ruins of the cabin, just a blackened outline now, the chimney still standing like a gravestone. Snow drifted gently into the crater where the hearth had been. Ethan reached down, brushed his hand along the cold stones, and found, miraculously, a glint of metal among the ashes. The corner of a fireproof tin box. The latch was scorched, but it opened. Inside lay Sam Walker's press ID, edges singed but legible. Ethan turned it over in his hand. "You did good, Sam," he whispered. He slipped the badge into his coat pocket, then looked at Ranger. "Time to build something new." By late afternoon, the helicopters were gone, leaving only the hush of wind and the sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves of burned logs. Ethan walked to the truck they'd towed back onto the road, climbed in, and looked once more at the horizon. Pine Hollow, small and stubborn, crouched beneath the mountains like a secret finally told. Weeks later, spring arrived quietly. Meltwater ran in silver threads down the slopes. The valley smelled of thawed soil and pine resin instead of chemicals. Construction crews in clean hazmat suits worked the riverbanks, sealing off the poison drainage lines. Ethan built a new cabin farther uphill, smaller, stronger, no ghosts in its walls. He laid the foundation himself, stone by stone, using old tools borrowed from the town. Ranger watched from the snowline, bandage gone, coat glossy again, tail sweeping slow arcs of contentment. When the last beam stood upright, Ethan paused, wiping sweat from his brow. The valley spread below him, cleared, quiet, beginning again. He reached down to scratch Ranger's neck. "Home," he said softly. The shepherd barked once, sharp and happy, then took off running through the snow, chasing sunlight. Ethan laughed, a sound that felt new in his throat. For the first time since he had arrived in Pine Hollow, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. He looked up at the clean sky and whispered, "We're home, buddy." The wind answered, gentle and warm, carrying away the last scent of smoke. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not the ones that change the world in a flash of light, but the quiet ones that help us survive the storm and rebuild when everything seems lost. Just like Ethan and his dog, faith can guide us through darkness when reason runs out. When we choose truth, courage, and compassion, we let God's light work through us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment to tell us how faith has led you through your own battles. And if you believe that God still works miracles in our everyday lives, write Amen in the comments. May the Lord bless you, protect your home, and give you strength for every new beginning. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep spreading the light.